Welcome to Civics and Coffee. My name is Alicia, and I am a self-professed history nerd. Each week, I'm going to chat about a topic on U.S. history and give you both the highlights and occasionally break down some of the complexities in history and share stories you may not remember learning in high school, all in the time it takes to enjoy a cup of coffee. Hey peeps, welcome back. A few weeks ago, I had the pleasure of speaking with Dr. Charlotte Gray. She is a historian and author who recently wrote a double biography of Jennie Jerome Churchill and Sara Delano Roosevelt. If those names sound familiar, it is because they are the mothers of political titans Winston Churchill and Franklin Roosevelt. Dr. Gray was kind enough to sit down with me and chat about the book and what we can learn about these men by studying their mothers. Our interview was conducted over Zoom, so apologies ahead of time for any dip in audio quality. I hope you all enjoy the interview. Hello, everyone. Joining me today is Dr. Charlotte Gray. Dr. Gray is a historian, author, and adjunct research professor in the Department of History at Carleton University. She has written several nonfiction books, including Passionate Mothers, Powerful Sons, The Lives of Jennie Jerome Churchill and Sara Delano Roosevelt, which will be the focus of our conversation today. Welcome, Dr. Gray.
Hi, great to be with you.
Thanks again. So you indicate in your opening of your book, but what made you decide to write about the mothers of two of the most influential men of the 20th century?
You know, I've always been intrigued by women's lives, and 99% of the books written about history focus on men. So I've often focused on women just because that gives history a whole other dimension. And it's a way of writing about social history and what life was like on the ground. And these two women intrigued me particularly because they were both born in 1854 within 60 miles of each other in New York, and both into the same extremely wealthy layer of society. And they went in such different directions. So it enabled me to explore that period of history, but also to show that even when women were living lives that today we think were incredibly restricted by Victorian traditions, they had a huge amount of agency in their lives, and they did very interesting things.
And what were some of the challenges as you navigate these two women writing kind of a double biography? What challenges did you face in writing this?
Well, of course, you know, you're writing two parallel lives, and the last thing you want to do is to write one, draw a deep breath, and then start at the beginning with the other one. And I was also focused very much on the stages of a woman's life, you know, how as a girl she was raised, what her parents were like, then how she develops in adolescence, how she chooses her partner. Both these women took their parents by surprise, how she is as a young wife and how she faces childbirth, what her relations are with her child. How does she establish the mother-son bond in this case? And also, what happens when she's widowed early? Both these women were widowed early. And I discovered that both, particularly FDR's mother, was devastated when her husband James died. But both women discovered an upside to widowhood. It meant that, you know, they actually had more freedom.
And Jennie Churchill used her role as wife and mother to protect and support her husband and then her son's career. So that got me thinking, how did both women use the role of domesticity to their and their family's benefit?
Well, I wouldn't say either of them had a particularly domestic role in that, you know, they were both lived in a very wealthy society. They had a lot of servants to do the kind of stuff that we think of as domestic today. They weren't doing their own laundry or ironing or cooking or any of the real life things that we do today. But they did have power behind the scenes. And the way that they exerted it, well, with Jennie, it was very much during Winston's career. She had an amazing network in London, and she massaged it like anything so that she could promote her son, her clever, boisterous, ambitious, arrogant son. She could promote him in journalism and in politics, and also give him a sense of his destiny as he was always going to be special. He was always going to be a leader. And Jennie herself had a public life as well as the private life of being a wife and mother. Sara, in contrast, great traditionalist, didn't push the boundaries the way that Jennie did, but on the other hand, was also equally determined to see that her son was going to be a huge success. She too imbued her son with a sense that he was special. He was an extraordinary individual who was going to go places. And she used her role as sort of mother and also as a very wealthy woman to do everything she could to enhance his prospects. She didn't want her son to go into politics, unlike Jennie. But when he did, she pivoted and decided that, her son was going to be a great statesman.
Right.
Politics was a dirty business, but FDR was going to be a statesman.
And you describe how Churchill's marriage was far from perfect, yet she remained dedicated to her husband's success. So why did she remain so invested in his political future?
In Lord Randolph Churchill's future?
Yes.
Well, she herself was ambitious. She felt very strongly that women could have a big role behind the scenes, sort of lubricating a network, enhancing her husband's image in his colleagues' eyes. And she would give these tremendous little dinner parties in London when Lord Randolph was first in politics to make sure that the Prime Minister had realized he had this very smart young man on his back benches. And then she was keen to ensure that Lord Randolph was going to be able to have the career he wanted, because she herself wanted to be standing next to the man who she expected in the early years of her marriage was going to be the leader of the British Empire. That was her great hope. Of course, it all came to a crashing halt because Lord Randolph, first of all, was sick. I don't know how we describe it today. It may have been syphilis. His family certainly believed that he had dementia because he had syphilis. It may have been a brain tumor. And also he was extraordinarily arrogant and didn't conduct himself very well in politics. But she was loyal to the end, not necessarily faithful. Jennie had an active libido, but she was loyal and she did everything she could to ensure his success until he died prematurely.
Yeah. And Franklin Roosevelt had a special bond with his mother. And so how did she help propel him to the White House?
As I said, she didn't want him to go into politics. She wanted him to be a gentleman of the old school in the Hudson Valley where they lived, because that's what her husband had been, and that's what she thought was an appropriate career for him. And she was happy for him to go to law school. But when he started hinting that he wanted a political career, she absolutely couldn't divert him. And so at that stage, she decides that she's going to do everything she can to support him. The main thing she did was always to devote the financial resources and that he needed for all his campaigns. And also Hyde Park, Springwood in Hyde Park, which is the family home, was always open to him. That was basically the house he was most identified with. In every triumph, when the press photographers rushed to the front steps of Springwood, there is Franklin Roosevelt standing next to his mother. Sometimes Eleanor's there, sometimes she's not. But his mother is the person who's looking up adoringly at him.
And speaking about Eleanor Roosevelt, how did Eleanor Roosevelt navigate that relationship with her mother-in-law?
That was very tricky. And it was tricky to write about, too, because, I mean, in her later years, Eleanor Roosevelt really was an incredible woman, a big proponent of the United Nations, a strong advocate for social justice and equality. She always represented the underprivileged. And, sort of by the 1960s, she was Saint Eleanor. But she had had a tremendous personal growth during her own life. When Franklin Roosevelt got engaged to her, she was only 19 and she'd had a completely miserable childhood. Her parents died very young. Her father was an alcoholic. And then her younger brother died. She was brought up by sort of grandparents in the Hudson Valley who didn't pay much attention to her. She didn't want to be a debutante, which was the automatic course for a woman of her background. She wanted to be a social worker, but that was unacceptable to her family. And she was damaged emotionally by feeling unloved, unworthy, and ugly. Franklin really did do great things for her ego by marrying her. But of course, for Sara, who always referred to Franklin as my boy, it was a shock because she thought that Franklin wouldn't get married for several years and that she and he would live together in the house in Manhattan. And then suddenly she discovers that behind her back, he's got engaged. So she's at first shocked and said they can't get married for a year. Franklin manages to sort of manipulate himself out of that one. Well, it is a year, but he stays very loyal to Eleanor. And Eleanor finds that she is now in a family that's actually very loving and very affectionate. She doesn't feel smothered by it to begin with. She is so grateful to Sara for her help, particularly because she has 6 children in 10 years. Well, imagine that, what that does for anyone. And Sara was always ready to step in and help and call the doctor when necessary, babysit the children, take the children to the country estate in Hyde Park. Huge, huge help to Eleanor, boost Eleanor. And the first letters that you see from Eleanor to Sara are so loving, so sort of desperately wanting Sara's affection. Over time, that changes. Eleanor begins to resent Sara. Eleanor begins to feel that she is being pushed out of her children's lives, that Sara's taking over. By the time Sara dies, in fact, Eleanor feels very little warmth to her mother-in-law at all. And only 4 years later, Eleanor's husband, Franklin, dies, and there's a rush of affection for Franklin, who's won 4 presidential elections, and as far as Americans are concerned, has won the war. And so there's affection for him. But Eleanor's jealousy and dislike of Sara starts seeping out into what she's writing in those years. She writes altogether 3 memoirs, and each is more critical of her mother-in-law. And that really has colored the way that Sara has been remembered in many ways.
Yeah. And then shifting kind of back to the relationship between mother and son, how did these relationships influence the actions of Franklin Roosevelt and Winston Churchill?
This is what I found most intriguing to write about, because it's territory that not many biographers get into. But what really struck me was that the primal relationship between a mother and child, in this case, in both cases, it's mother and son, is the way that the child learns to deal with relationships more generally. So in Winston Churchill's case, he has this mother. She's only 20 when he's born. He's a healthy baby, but he's immediately handed off to a nanny. And Jennie loves parties. She's very social. She's very busy promoting her husband's career. And she immediately sort of assumes that she can do what aristocratic women in that period do, which is to just leave the upbringing of her child to a nanny and various maids, and then to boarding school. That's what happens to the children of the aristocrats in Britain. She does love Winston, and she'll go up and play with him before dinner, but she doesn't take sort of primary care for him. Now, Winston is a very bumptious, demanding, needy little boy, and he spends the whole time wanting her. And you read these pathetic letters, actually, from his boarding school, where he went when he was only 8, saying, "Please, Mummy, come and see me. Please, Mummy, write me a letter." She did write him letters, but he could never have enough. And as he grew up, he developed a way of dealing with her, which was a combination of sort of pleas and anger and sort of sometimes emotional blackmail, but very intense and very demanding. And actually, that's how he dealt with his colleagues in government, in the Conservative Party, and in during the war. So it's a combination of sort of seduction and bullying. but very close. In contrast, the way that Sara and Franklin relate is the opposite. Franklin never had to sort of be needy and demanding with his mother. She was always there. She was always there, determined to make sure that he had the best upbringing possible. She made him feel very special. She barely left him alone. I mean, she wept when she had to cut his baby curls off and he was already 5 years old. She didn't want him to go to boarding school when he eventually goes 2 years later than most boys. You know, if he doesn't write to her twice a week, she will send a telegram to the principal of the school demanding to know if Franklin is sick. There must be a problem. So she is the original helicopter parent. And as a result, he feels so secure. He knows he has his mother's love, unlike Winston. He knows that this is something he can just take for granted. And sometimes he really doesn't want her quite so close. Mm. So he's quite good at developing the kind of hobbies like stamp collecting or bird watching, where you're in your own world and your mother can't intrude. And he is always sweet and charming. He always, throughout his life, has a wonderful smile. He makes people feel good and he keeps them at arm's length. People would come out of his office at the White House and sort of say, that was a great meeting. Oh, wait a minute. I didn't get what I asked for. He was extremely good at keeping people at bay.
And shifting from their relationships to more of these women, how does studying these women in particular help us really better understand Churchill and Roosevelt?
Well, as I said, I think it helps us understand how they developed their attitude to dealing with other people. I mean, it's nature and nurture. Mm-hmm. So nature is their innate personalities that they were born with. Nurture is their relationships with their mothers. And that comes through in their public behavior.
And how have the reputations of these two women evolved over time? You mentioned, Eleanor Roosevelt kind of had a major play in some of the earlier understandings of her mother-in-law, but that these reputations have evolved. So how have they evolved over time?
One of the things that struck me when I began the research after I decided to do the book was that I began by reading the best biographies about their famous sons. And I realized that in almost all cases, the books were written by men. And also, the mothers were given very short shrift. They were sort of discarded pretty fast from the narrative. And then, in fact, some of the books were extremely critical. I mean, Jennie was dismissed as this sort of flirtatious lightweight, and Sara was dismissed as this smothering mother. It was like, that the men had to emerge from the hardship of their relationships with their mother and be even greater men than they were already. And I thought, well, hang on a minute, that's not fair. Because when I started looking at the women's lives, first of all, I realized that, Jennie was flirtatious. Jennie had affairs, she had a libido, get over it. And a lot of the comment at the time, and certainly subsequently, has been frankly misogynist, double standards of women shouldn't have affairs, but men are bigger if they do have affairs. So I knew that she had done other things. She'd outfitted a hospital ship for wounded British soldiers who'd fought in the 1900 South African War. She had started a campaign to build a national theatre. She had started a literary journal, which was quite impressive. She had all these other initiatives she'd taken, which her son's biographers rarely mentioned. They were too busy saying how much shopping she did. Similarly, with Eleanor and Sara had done a lot in terms of looking after her son, rising to the challenge of being a single mother. She also ran this large estate in the Hudson Valley, which had proved to be the most sort of wonderful anchor for Franklin himself. She always supported him And one of the things she had done, which she herself would have been surprised by, was that when Franklin becomes the president in 1932, a lot of his own party, the Democratic Party, thought that he was far too close to socialism, particularly his wife, who, because Eleanor was already a voice for the underprivileged, and she would nag her husband about those causes. And Eleanor did not want to be the first lady. She realized that she wanted to be more than a hostess in the White House. And Sara, in fact, sort of stepped into that role in some ways, so that Sara, for example, was on the cover of Time magazine the week of her son's inauguration. It wasn't Franklin who was on Time magazine, it was Sara. And Sara became this sort of wonderful American matriarch who stood for old-fashioned values and a sense of propriety within society and support for the status quo, which reassured some members of the Democratic Party who found her son a little too progressive. So that they played important roles in really providing for their sons, not just upbringings where the sons emerged with a sense of destiny, but also the kind of support that was appropriate at different points in their careers.
And where should readers go when they finish your book and they want to learn more about these women?
If they want to learn more, actually, there are good biographies of Jennie Jerome, as you'd expect, because she is a very colorful character. There's Anne Sieber, who's a British writer, has done a wonderful biography of Jennie. Sara, actually, there is no good source for. It was more difficult writing about her than about Jennie because there was less material, because she is a traditional and rather old-fashioned figure who did play a huge role, but who nobody has written a full biography of her at all. She wrote a book, there was a book called My Boy, which was supposed to be by her. In fact, it was by two women journalists, which was about the upbringing of Franklin Roosevelt. But otherwise, there's actually no good source on Sara. I think she deserves better.
All right. So all the future historians out there, take note. And so what do you hope readers take away from this?
I think I want them to take away two things. The first is there's absolutely no cookie cutter pattern for mother-son bonds. But one of the most important things is to imbue your child with a sense that he is a really exceptional individual who will go places. That made so much difference, so much effect on these two men. And the second is, don't assume that the only women in history are the ones that broke the barriers. Interestingly about these two women, neither of them supported votes for women. In their day, women had no political power. They couldn't vote, they couldn't hold political office, they couldn't exert much of a public role at all. And these two women accepted that. They accepted the status quo, and they only changed their minds and started supporting votes for women when their sons, for political reasons, did. When their sons started endorsing women's suffrage, because it was politically actually inevitably going to happen, the two mothers did too. But they were not sort of strong advocates for it at all. And yet they were able to exert a lot of agency within their own lives. They were able to make decisions. I think we're patronizing about the 90% of women during their period who did not at first think that women should have a role in the public life, and then who changed their minds, who grew with the social movement. So I like the idea that women will look back at these two individuals and say, they grew in their own lives. They changed their minds. We can all do that. We can adopt new views. We don't have to stick with the assumptions we were raised with.
And knowing that this is fresh off the presses, is there anything you're working on now that you're excited about and can share about?
I have several ideas of what I want to do next. I'm really interested in individuals who reinvent themselves, who start off. Sometimes it's a question of identity. Sometimes it's a question of country. but individuals who change and who suddenly halfway through their lives start again. I think that's a fascinating phenomenon.
Yeah. And where can people find more about you and your work?
On my website, www.charlottegray.ca. I'm
Wonderful.
a Canadian writer, and I've had other books published outside Canada, of course. As you might have detected, I wasn't actually born in Canada. So I've had a pretty big range of, I've lived in UK, US, and Canada, and I'd love people to visit my website and see what else I've written.
Wonderful. And I'll be sure to put the website on the show notes for the episode when this goes live. And is there anything that we haven't covered yet that you'd like future readers to know?
That's a tough question, because actually you asked such good questions that I feel that I have mainly covered them. Except, actually, one thing I'd like to say is I had a lot of fun writing this biography. And you can tell in the writing, I think, because I just so enjoyed diving into these different worlds and seeing the connection with mine, and seeing too how these two formidable women made their own decisions. I really wanted to say those two men who basically shaped the world in the middle of the 20th century, they were so lucky to have those formidable women as their mothers.
Yes, definitely. All right. So for my listeners out there, I'd highly recommend picking up a copy of Passionate Mothers, Powerful Sons. It is an interesting and intriguing and thorough look at women and their roles in society during this period, and provides a new context with which to understand the early days of two political leaders. The double biography reads like a novel, and you won't be able to put it down. Thank you, Dr. Gray.
Thank you so much. This has been great.
And there you have it, folks. Thanks again to Dr. Gray for spending her time with me. If you want to learn more about her and her work, please check out the show notes of the episode, where I've included a link to her website. Thanks, peeps. I'll see you next week. Thanks for tuning in, and I hope you enjoyed this episode of Civics and Coffee. If you want to hear more small snippets from American history, be sure to subscribe wherever you get your podcasts. Thanks for joining me, and I look forward to our next cup of coffee together.